I'm going to briefly talk about variations in standard contracts. And when I'm going to talk about standard contracts, I'm obviously talking more generally. I'm actually going to cover a couple of areas which I see, particularly in Vietnamese projects, even though international, where there are certainly areas that need to be thought about. But predominantly, I'm going to be talking about international contracts. And then I'm going to talk about cost versus value, which is a concept that obviously is commonly used within the variation clauses of different standard forms of contracts. Then I'm going to be talking briefly about some of the challenges that I see with the standard forms of contracts and how they're actually applied in Vietnam on some of those international projects. And I'm going to briefly finish talking about loss and expense around which the delay and disruption. So just generally, in terms of construction contracts, it comes back to the drivers of that contract. So in effect, here's listed some main contracts that some of you may be familiar with and some of the differences between those forms. Now, in effect, we're looking at whether they're traditional, design and build contracts. And that comes down to a procurement process of the contractor, which governs how that is derived. And obviously under FIDIC has its own terms based on traditional contracting, based on design and build, and goes further to even operation-led contracts as well. And then taking something like the NEC, which some of you may be familiar with, the NEC is used in pockets around the world. I literally use the word pockets because it is quite random in some of the places that do use NEC quite regularly. Obviously, it's used very much in the UK. We use it on our mega projects. So like the Hinkley nuclear power station is being built in the UK, which is one of the largest construction projects in Europe. That's all under NEC. Some of all our rail network upgrades and systems, which have been major projects in the UK, are also all NEC. But NEC is also used a lot in Hong Kong. It has been for a long time. It's now one of the preferred contract forms that's used in Hong Kong. But it's actually, strangely enough, also used in Peru as well. I've got a large case at the moment around a large PFI project, which was related to schools and hospitals being built in Peru, and they're again all under NEC. So that's why I use the words pockets, because it is a bit random where it's used. And then obviously then you have more of your domestic forms of contracts that are used for your domestic markets, and they obviously can be traditional and lump sum depending on those different forms. And obviously there's too many to be going through in this session. Now, the basis of quantification is important, because the basis of quantification obviously comes down to how we assess sometimes variations and even measured works values. So in Vietnam, for example, there's a decree 37 2015 NDC, which was amended in 2021 by 5021 NPCP. And what the Vietnamese government set out is that there are lump sums, fixed unit price contracts, adjustment unit price contracts, time-based contracts, which is an interesting one, I'll come on to that in a minute, and cost plus fee. So listed there is some of the main ones, but there is also, of course, cost plus contracts, which are quite regular, construction management. And then when we come down to time contracts, they're probably extremely rare, but they do exist in other jurisdictions where they are called day work, and that's typically what they're referred to. Now, in terms of the measurement of those contracts, that could be defined. So some of you may know or may have heard of this, particularly from common law jurisdictions, but the standard method of measurement, 7th edition. It's been around since 1988. It was derived by the RICS, and the RICS use it as a standard form of how you measure pretty much anything relating to building. And then there was a CESM, which came out for anything to do with civils. Now, those codes and standards were rolled all over the world. So in Singapore, they have their own standard, which comes from SMM7. The same as Philippines as well, also has its own standard. I saw that in one of the slides earlier, the PSSN. And Vietnam have the TCVN, which is a completely different standard of engineering standards. But effectively, it does give guidance around how you effectively measure and value, and that comes back to the quantification issue. And then I'll just briefly the description of change. So when we talk about change, and we talk about changes in the variation, obviously different contracts call it different things. So again, NEC terminology is a compensation event, and the process around a compensation event is very, very different to most other standard forms of contracts. It largely works on a prospective basis, the same as delay does, as Amit was just setting out earlier. So even the delay analysis that you do as a compensation event is all forward-looking. It's not a retrospective contract. It deals with things as they arise, as they come up. It puts it to bed, and you move on with the projects. And the idea behind the NEC and the philosophy behind it, and one of the reasons why it's so popular on major infrastructure projects, is because it keeps the account moving. It doesn't leave everything to the end of the job where the contractor puts this massive claim in and says, right, I want 150 million. And I've not told you that for the last 7 years, but I want 150 million. It deals with it prospectively as you go through the contract. It's not a retrospective contract. So again, it calls it compensation events because it's an event that comes up that requires compensation, not a variation where you look at it retrospectively. So coming on to cost and value. Cost claims typically are damages or actual loss. Obviously, they can be prescribed on the contract. They're normally under a typical remedy that they'd be entitled to that, i.e. I'm in delay, I'm incurring costs, therefore I want to recover it. It's ultimately reliant on on factual information, and it can become very, very heavy on records to prove a cost claim. Typically, we see these a lot in delay. So again, it also comes back to the delay analysis that obviously flows into quantum. Whereas value is interesting, and this is why I put the two words up here in Vietnamese, and I hope the translation's right on this, but this is really, really important to understand when you're looking at a contract, because value-related claims are different. Value-related claims relate to the entitlement under the contract. It doesn't have anything to do with cost. I can say to you, I'm going to sell you a table for 500,000 Vietnamese dong, but actually it might only cost me 250,000. Doesn't mean that the value of that work is 250,000. It has nothing to do with that. So typical entitlement for variation will be typically under a value-related mechanism under most contracts. And the valuation will be assessed, and it's less reliant on records. Now, that is why typically, from a contractor standpoint, a value-related claim is often easier to pursue than it is for a cost-based claim, because of the reasons I've set out around the records. So strategically, that's where a lot of contractors go to. Now, under FIDIC, FIDIC's been quite heavily covered in the last session, so I don't want to go too much into this, but effectively, variations can obviously occur for multiple different reasons. So I've just set out there some of the main reasons why obviously the variation could come arising. I mean, one of the key things I've just put there, again, this is a note I've made throughout, but under a FIDIC contract under Vietnamese law, there has to be consideration to how that works. Now, I'm not a lawyer, I don't know Vietnamese law, but certainly as a quantum expert, we have to have a good understanding of that. I'll give a real practical example of this. So Professor Zoom, who's at this university, is a lecturer in Vietnamese law. He's one of the leading experts of Vietnamese law. Now, he and I have worked on a case fairly recently for a Vietnamese state entity, which was a large case under a FIDIC contract. It was under Silverbook. And they agreed to DLDs, delay liquidated damages, at a certain rate in the contract. Now, under Vietnamese law, there, as I understand it from Professor Zoom, there is a different position around how damages can be applied under Vietnamese law, and it can't be a penalty, it can't be a pre-ascertained loss. It has to go back to a general approach to damages. And that comes back to a civil law coding, but also the French influence of coding around civil law, as I understand it. So again, under a FIDIC contract, it will have a pre-ascertained loss for every week the contractor's late, but trying to enforce that through a Vietnamese entity becomes difficult, particularly if it's got jurisdiction under Vietnam. So these areas of the law and the civil code have to be considered around variations around claims, particularly in Vietnam, even if it's got an international contractor involved, particularly if there's Vietnamese entities involved where they are subject to the Ministry of Construction and other government entities that then set about rules on how such variations and others are actually meant to be priced. And Vietnam has a very unique position of that in Asia, which I must admit, working across most of Asia in my career, I've not seen it quite as intense as it is in Vietnam, and trying to understand that, particularly somebody who's not Vietnamese, has been quite challenging. So understand how a variation is changed. So obviously we talked about this earlier, but the key thing here is about the valuation rules. They're the rules of the contract on the standard form that tell you how you value the variation. And those rules can be different, obviously, depending on the contract, but using a standard FIDIC contract, so this is traditional, the variations will be valued under the same rates and prices set out in the contract. That's an easy one. So you're putting an extra metre squared of brickwork in. There's a rate in the contract, you use that rate, that's easy. Use the relevant rates and prices set out in the contract as a basis of the valuation with a reasonable uplift or adjustment. So that might be, well, I was going to do 1,000 metres squared of brickwork, but I'm now only going to do 1. So there's an adjustment in the quantity and the methodology, so I adjust it accordingly. New rates or prices to be arrived from reasonable cost. So lots of contracts talk about cost and how you then assess the cost coming from it. So such as NEC talks about defined cost, which is not actual cost, it's defined cost under the contract, that uses a series of schedules in the contract called the short schedule cost components, where they value that. Under FIDIC, it's fairly silent, but there can obviously be agreement upon rates at the outset, and also how you apply those rates. And then provisional as well. So if it's not clear what the work is, assumptions can be made by the engineer, and provisional prices can be put in, and those provisional sums can be defined or undefined, and they may or may not have an impact on the programme. And then use of day work as well, which is typically only used in real emergency areas, incidental nature of where they're required. And of course, under FIDIC, there's the position around the percentage of change. So just going to use a practical example here. This is a UK project. So you can see the two boards on the right-hand side. These are both Kingspan boards. These you can go and buy in Vietnam, as I understand it, but you can buy them from most builders merchants. Now, the variation was, it was being changed from a cool firm K12 framing board, which will probably mean nothing to nobody, and it was being changed to a K15 board. Now, the one in the left-hand side at the top is a K12, and the one below is K15. Look exactly the same, pretty much. Interestingly, they actually cost about the same. So if you phone up a builder's merchant, this was in the UK, they're £30 a metre squared. That's the price of it. So this particular dispute, which went to the High Court, was all about the client saying, hang a minute, I've changed the cladding for a buildability issue, and you're charging me more money for the installation board of my external cladding. But I've phoned the builder's merchant. The builder's merchant's told me it's £30 a metre squared. So where is the change? Now, as you can see, where I've split it out, you can see that the orange area is the labour. The labour actually went up from £5 a metre squared to £20 a metre squared. And whilst the plant stayed the same, the percentage additions, which effectively would be your overheads and profit, your preliminaries, etc., or your indirects, went up accordingly with the value. So this whole case was about this. And the reason why it happened is because if you go to the next slide, that's the board there on the left-hand side of the lower end product. And that's effectively just being fitted in between the studs, and they're being worked around that area. The one on the right-hand side, as you can see, it had to be set out, had to be fixed back into the existing system. And there also had to be wall fixing behind that goes into the hollow blockwork behind. Complete change. But again, from the face of it, it looked like it was a fairly straightforward change from the client. And this ultimately ended up going all the way to litigation, which our side won, by the way. So just coming on to international projects with Vietnam, just some points to make here. So if there's an EPC contract and it involves a Vietnamese entity, in my experience, particularly on some of the large power stations within Vietnam, where it would say PVN, for example, Petro Vietnam, or some of the other state entities, and they were using subsidiaries where they form a JV with an international partner, which is quite a popular way of procuring in Vietnam to give, obviously, the local skill sets, local labour, but also using expertise from international markets. Now, the problem is with this area is that typically under Vietnam, with the Ministry of Construction, they have a very, very detailed way of revaluing rates. Right, thank you. So, and with the Ministry of Construction, they set rates based on different regions, and I appreciate many of you will probably already know this. And obviously, those rate adjustments change all the time. There's constant bulletins around labour rates have gone up in this region, or the price of fuel will go up in this region. So these rates are constantly adjusted, and Vietnamese companies are expected to comply with the Ministry of Construction. And these rates are even audited, as I understand it, at the end of the project. The Ministry of Construction will then go through and re-audit all of these rates. Now, they use first principles to generate these rates, which is not a process you see anymore in most international communities. In the UK, we used to have it. We used to have our equivalent of a Ministry of Construction that used to set out rates and how those rates would be priced for public sector work. But over the years of using international companies into the UK, the restructure of the government, it meant that we've privatised a lot of those firms, and it means that we then go back to the usual sort of pricing that you see on an international level. But obviously, where there's a Vietnamese and an international partner, the Vietnamese entity, particularly if they're doing something like civils, so there's a lot of large civil engineering contractors in Vietnam, in particular Songa 5, Songa 9, PTSC. You know, they have large reach of capability to be able to perform what is quite frankly huge civil engineering projects. But ultimately, they work to their own standards and they work to the contracts that they're familiar with and the way that the rates are valued. So when a large Korean or Japanese contractor comes into that project and they JV, you can often find that the Korean and Japanese contractor is under a lump sum or some sort of form of a fixed price. And the Vietnamese entity may be under a subject to remeasure. So you've got a mix match straight away within the contract between the two. And that can create all sorts of issues when you come down to variations, particularly if there's an element, say, on a power station where there was an equipment change that led to some civil work. Straight away, you've got a variation happening on one part of the JV, and then you've got another one on the other side. And of course, then there's the other implications around the law and how the Vietnamese law then obviously works on that contract. So just going to finish off talking briefly about disruption. Now, disruption is a huge area. The SCL Delay and Disruption Protocol, second edition, details out quite thoroughly around disruption. That was something that came in more in the second edition from the first. It was something that actually Society of Construction Law put a working group together, which one of my colleagues actually sat on to work through that. And in effect, to measure disruption is a change to the project, and a lot of times it's happened due to a change. There's lots of different ways in which you can measure and value it. So going back to what Amit was describing around delay, equally disruption has all of these different options. Now, the first one you won't actually find in the SCL protocol, and that is because it's a direct valuation. In effect, it's valuing it like a variation. And I think the reason why the SCL didn't cover that is because it's pretty obvious how to do that, but equally it's not relying on any sort of productivity assessment per se. It's largely looking at the individual element. So 2, 3, 4 and 5 are all productivity, and 6 and 7 are cost-based assessments. Now, one of the key things on the right hand side is you can see that there's an arrow, and really what I'm trying to set out there is that in my experience of working on various disruption claims all over the world actually, that there does seem to be a trend on which ones tend to have the most success. And as I say, a direct valuation tends to be the highest in my career. And that tends to be looking at the actual cause, the actual effect, and actually using causation to actually understand how the cost has actually transpired into that loss. And doing it on an item by item basis and effectively closing it out. Whereas something like a measured mile, which some of you may be more familiar with, it's a concept that came over from the US that is now pretty much everywhere pretty much everyone recognises it now in the world. But that's looking at a sample size of what you were producing as a disruption element before the disruption event occurred. So let's just say it's weather, for example. On a beautiful sunny day, what were you achieving, or what should you be achieving? What's your average across a general weather platform? And then how did that weather change, and how did the corresponding disruption occur? And then you measure the two to effectively offset. Value analysis, that has to be set up at early doors. As I said before, in my contracting experience, I worked quite extensively with Vinci installing earned value analysis across all their projects. They still widely use it across all their international projects. And effectively what it does is it measures earned hours against planned effectively to understand what the loss is of the productivity. And then you can get more into system dynamics and others. System dynamics is definitely an area of real interest. And that's somewhere at the moment, in my experience, I've not seen anything yet that is particularly compelling around that. But I definitely know, and I've even been speaking to some people on the tech side that are saying that's getting better. And I'm currently looking at an option around that, particularly to be used on metro projects, where we can start to plot out how the disruption was actually occurring in particular areas from general records that have just been kept on the project. So that got quite excited about. And if we could, hopefully use that as an organisation, I think that certainly on a lot of the metro projects I've worked on in my career, they've all had huge disruption elements to their work through the nature of the projects. Industry and academic studies tend to become a little bit more loose. Some of you may know or may have heard of Professor Ibbs, who's in the US. Professor Ibbs created what was known as curves, effectively productivity curves. He uses them regularly. I've worked on a case which he was on, and he uses them to plot out loss of productivity from his curves, which come back from industry studies that he's done in the US. And then cost-based studies, they come back to what you've actually incurred, what your actual cost is, and they're probably more basic, but typically tend to be less successful. Okay, so I think that's all for me. So thank you for your attention.